Hey, welcome to the InNOLEvation Mindset Podcast, powered by the Jim Moran College of Entrepreneurship. I am Mark McNeese, your host, and today in studio we have Associate Professor Meredith McQuerry from the Jim Moran College of Entrepreneurship. Hey, thanks for coming in, Meredith. How you doing?
Doing great, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about what you do here at FSU.
Yeah, sure. So I'm in my 8th year at Florida State University. It's hard to believe. And I'm an associate professor in our textiles and apparel program, really in the area of textile science. I teach textile testing and quality assurance, some intro to textile science courses. And then on the graduate level, I teach some really innovative things in technology advancements. And so that's really fun for me in terms of kind of getting into the literature, sitting down with the students, having some discussions, things like that. So I really enjoy what I do on the teaching side. And then I do a lot of research on the side of firefighting and PPE especially.
Yeah, no, that's really exciting. And I've been excited about speaking with you because, as you know, you've worked with my daughter,
Right.
who is a firefighter. So is that part of the Thermonol Comfort Lab?
Yeah, that's a good question. So some of it is and some of it isn't. So in the last probably 5 or 6 years, we've had 2 now federally funded grants associated with female firefighting PPE. The first was a preliminary investigation where we were trying to figure out kind of what were the root causes, design, comfort, mobility issues of the gear that they were wearing. And thankfully, last fall, we just received another $1.5 million to continue that for the next few years. And we're actually going to be able to take what we collected in that first study, apply it, and at the end, we will have market-ready prototypes for women in the fire service. So a little bit of that second project is going to involve bringing some prototypes down to the Thermonol Comfort Lab, doing some testing there. But the Thermonol Comfort Lab is home to Andy. He's the only dynamic sweating thermal mannequin. He's the first one at a public institution in the world. We're really proud of that here at FSU. And so he does some really neat things, but we test all types of gear on there, whether it's firefighting PPE. We just did a pretty large contract for the U.S. military last year. We've done racing suits and even recently some medical devices. So he gets a lot of use and opportunities for sure.
No, that's great. So what's some of the problems that you're trying to solve that female firefighters have with current, I would imagine, male-designed gear?
Yes, absolutely. And we're so thankful for your daughter and all of our local female firefighters because that can be a challenge. And honestly, when I first came to FSU, I've been working with some private PPE manufacturers for nearly 15 years. And they said, "Oh, we're so excited. You're at FSU. We'd like to work with you. What would you like? Do you have any ideas? What would you like to study and research?" And so I said, well, I really realized during my PhD that we were doing all these studies, but they were all on male firefighters. We were never including women. And so I said, I want to study PPE for women. And of course, at the time, this was pre-Me Too movement. Mm-hmm. It was, no, there's no market share in that, right? That's not a valid excuse anymore. And plus, there's now 11% of the U.S. Fire Service on the volunteer side is women, 5% career. So there's almost 100,000 female firefighters in this country.
That's really interesting. I was just going to ask you, what's the percentage? What's the growth been, let's say, over the past 20 years? Do you know?
The 20 years is hard to say. I mean, we're talking like 1-2% probably 20 years ago.
Right.
Even when I first started getting interested in this back in 2016, 2017, it was at 4%.
Okay.
And so it's really, really grown. It's gotten a lot of attention. Thankfully, FEMA has prioritized this. And through funding our study, we've been able to go out and disseminate and share that with the fire service in academic scenarios and really get to the root cause, as you asked. It comes down to women are trying to wear something that's made for the male human form. It's not made for their body.
Right. So what, just to make it tangible for me and our listeners, what are the specific problems that are associated with trying to adapt something designed for a male to a female.
To a female, yeah. You've got totally different anthropometrics or body measurements. You've got totally different body shapes and proportions as well. And so a lot of what happens is, and what we heard in our focus groups and in our nationwide survey, we had over 2,000 responses, was that 80% of women in the fire service in the U.S. are experiencing improper fit. And 80% of those say it's leading to poor mobility. And we know women in the fire service had a 33% greater risk of injury because of that. So it's not just it's uncomfortable, it's a safety issue. Right. It increases their risk of injury and fatality as well. But it really comes down to, it's not meant to fit the bust area, obviously. So I'm going to size up in the chest. And now when I go to work overhead and do like a pike pull and overhaul, I can't move, right? I can't see what I'm doing.
Right.
We had female firefighters describe how their helmets fell off because it doesn't accommodate their hair, right?
Oh, okay.
So a lot of scenarios, the boots, the gloves, the PPE elements on top of the actual clothing is a whole nother issue as well. Yeah.
Oh, great. So you mentioned Anthropometric?
Yes.
Is that right? Yes. Anthropometric?
Yes. So anthropometrics or anthropometry, it's just a fancy word for body measurements.
All right. Very good. And my understanding is you collected the first database. Has other people been able to use that? Why is that important?
Yeah, it's a great question. So up until our study, no one had collected a comprehensive set of body measurements of U.S. female firefighters. There was a small study in the early 2000s in the UK, and then there was a small study in 2015, but it was for fire trucks. So how to sit in a fire truck. It wasn't apples to apples with measurements you would need to make actual clothing. And so, really it's enabling us to design better PPE. So it's really important to the manufacturers so that they can make women's gear and women's gear that properly fits. Because there is some out there, it just doesn't fit very well because they never had this data to design off of. Also, it's really important and helpful to the standards body. So the National Fire Protection Association, they set the standard sizing requirements and they have requirements for women's gear. And we were able to identify for both structural and wildland some major faults in that sizing system. So we've presented that both to the technical committee and are publishing that now, but it has far-reaching applications beyond just even really the fire service. So for example, in the last year, I've been helping with some standards bodies, ASTM, it's an international organization, and they are trying to develop a standard for a female flash fire mannequin. So basically it gets flames and torches thrown at it, and the gear has to withstand a 4-second exposure, like worst case flashover condition for a firefighter, right? They've got to be able to get out of there before they receive a 2nd-degree burn. They have about 17 and a half seconds to do that. And so we've only ever evaluated and tested this PPE on a male form. That's part of the issue. And so for the first time now, we need to develop a female flash fire mannequin because clothing layers are different, insulation is different around the female form that needs to be studied. There is a mannequin that has been developed by the military. There's a female mannequin that's been developed up in Canada. But for the most part, there's no standard for that. So we're kind of the sole informant of what those body dimensions need to be.
Oh, wow. So is it on the college's radar to get a female form like Andy with an I?
It's almost like I paid you to say that, right? To plug that. So yeah, we would actually love that. In fact, Andy came out in about 2018, 2019. We got him here at 2020. He was the 7th one ever made. He's still only the 3rd or 4th one in North America. And I think 2020, 2021, they came out with what they call Liz, and that's named after Liz McCullough, who was an amazing professor and pioneer in thermal comfort research at Kansas State University. So it's the first female sweating thermal mannequin. Now, she doesn't have all the capabilities of Andy, our model here. So she's not as dynamic, but she is, capable of measuring heat loss and all the things that we would typically want to measure and need to measure from a standard case. So certainly that's definitely on our radar, especially as I do a lot of this research with my colleague, Dr. Cassandra Kwan at NC State. And so we have far-reaching goals for where we want to be. Like I mentioned, we need to do a study on gloves. We need to do a study on boots. And so ultimately, we talk a lot, and I do a lot on full systems approach, right? Like looking at a system holistically, that it's not just about one part, but it's about how all parts parts integrate and work together and interface with one another. And so when we start to get to that level of assessment, then that's the type of instrumentation that we will need. Yeah.
No, that's super cool. So what has, in your research over the years, has there been anything that's been kind of a surprise, like, oh, wow, I didn't expect this to be a fact?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually one of those things is going back to the standards body. They have requirements for how the clothing has to perform, right? So you take the fabric on a two-dimensional form and you say, well, this is a thermal protection value of 35. That gets you your 17 and a half seconds of protection, right? The problem is that's a two-dimensional flat fabric. So the standards body does not currently take into account how the garment's actually worn, which is on a three-dimensional body with layers and air gaps. They also add a lot to that fabric. They add trim and padding and reinforcements and labels and all these additional layers. So I did some research a few years ago to kind of quantify that and found that like less than 20% of the front of a turnout coat is just the two-dimensional fabric that they're testing. And when you then put that on TPP and you look at heat loss values, you're nowhere near where you should be in terms of breathability. And that's a lot of what I study is how to prevent heat stress. That's actually the number one cause of firefighter fatalities. It's not burns. We've done a great job protecting them, but to the point that we've exacerbated it and caused a different type of fatality. And so trying to balance that and come up with an optimal functional design, that's really what we're constantly working to do. And just looking at how all those items break down from the fabric level and then build back up to a whole garment or whole product level. It's always kind of interesting to see like, oh, I would have had no idea that, putting a vent in there, which is something that I studied and explored, we ultimately found that could decrease your core temperature rise by 1.3 degrees Celsius. And, you start at 37 C,
right.
You go to 40 and you're talking fatality. So over a 1 degree C reduction, like that's huge, just from cutting a hole in a fabric, right? It sounds simple, but,
Yeah. And I think that some of the best innovations are the simple ones, right?
Right,
it's
absolutely.
like, oh, wow, this can make a major difference if we just tweak it like this. So where does this all come from? What drives your research? What started it?
Yeah.
What gets you up in the morning? Why are you doing this? You're doing so much work in it, which I'm obviously really, as a dad of a firefighter, female, I'm super happy that you're doing it. But what's the why?
Yeah, it's a great question. I get this question a lot, like, why firefighting PPE? Do you have a relative who's a firefighter? And I don't. I didn't have any personal connection to the fire service. During undergraduate, I was double majoring in two majors that had absolutely no overlap whatsoever. And I took a textile science class as part of one of those that I had to take. And I realized that I loved science when it was in the context of something I cared about, which was clothing at that time and still is. And my professor recognized my strong performance in the classroom and offered me an opportunity to work in the lab. I spent the first 6 months serging and ironing. That's all I did. I was the gopher. I put in my time. But that professor had a project looking at firefighting PPE and its durability. So the fabric durability and the fabric performance. So I got to help out the graduate students at the time. I trained under them. And then that became my master's project. And I just fell in love with it. I got to go to conferences. I got to hear firsthand how this research was really benefiting the fire service. And so ultimately my goal is just to move the needle forward inch by inch, right? And, we do these revolutionary projects, we call them, but at the end of the day, we're working within a lot of confines of standards and use conditions. They're going into a burning building. There's only so much we can do. But trying to push the needle and look at new innovation, look at new technology that we can incorporate into the gear. Ultimately, that's what gets me up in the morning, is to just maybe one day have that one innovative idea that's going to save a life or something like that. Yeah.
Speaking of that, like, how much feedback do you get from female firefighters in the work you're doing? Or do they even know that, you're the mad scientist behind all this happening?
Yeah, I will say the fire services, honestly, working with the fire services is my absolute favorite thing to do. And that's what keeps me going when I'm kind of bogged down in the lab or writing papers. I mean, I do it ultimately because they're the kindest, most gracious population to work with, male or female. And certainly anytime I was just at Fiero, which is an educational symposium for the fire service, and I had 2 presentations and I couldn't even make it out of the room before the next presentation started in between because I had people lined up. I mean, just willing to, hey, I've got female firefighters, or I'm a female firefighter. Can you come to Colorado this summer? We want you to present, just willing to, how can we help? How can we be a part of it? And so that is just, we're so thankful for that. Yeah.
Well, even if you're doing great things, there's always challenges, right? So what's top of mind of what's one of the big challenges that you face? Is it economic? Is it funding? Is it social? What have you faced?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's just day-to-day operations, right? And for me personally, it's been when to delegate, right? Kind of, I like to know that things are done correctly, right? And the easiest way to do that often is to do it yourself. But we're now operating at a level of demand that I can't do everything myself. So this project in particular, the recent one, has been great. We've brought on Dr. Balaji, who's now a postdoc here. We've got a great team of graduate and undergraduate students. But my biggest pinch and pain point, at least recently, is, it's just, I operate over probably $2 to $3 million worth of lab equipment and lab space. And so something's always broken no matter what I do, no matter how often I have somebody come in and service and maintain it. In fact, there's a lab technician right now in the Thermal Comfort Lab trying to fix, we've got an issue with the walking stand. So that's really the big challenge now is, me growing and learning, kind of with an entrepreneurial lens, right, of operating 2 labs that service industry clients and customers of, I've got a report right now due to a client, in the industry that needs to get out. And that's funding that supports our graduate students, supports that lab maintenance and things like that. So just trying to manage all of that, delegate, and then just keeping things working that are supposed to be. Yeah.
Sounds great. So I'm an outsider on the research world, and probably most of the people who are listening are outsiders. And we hear about the money, $1 million here, $1 million there.
Yeah.
Where's that money come from? Yeah. How do you get it, and where does it go besides, I guess, maintenance and buying stuff?
Yeah.
Is there extra? Are you a multimillionaire? How does this all work?
Certainly not going to my pockets, that's for sure. So I have a few different streams of funding mechanisms. So my first funding mechanism when I came here, I'll just kind of start chronologically in terms of historical experience, was private industry. So I had built really strong network and relationships with 4 or 5 of the leading PPE manufacturers during grad school, and have been lucky that 2 or 3 of those have pretty much continuously funded projects, whether it was new PPE or even collaborating with Dr. Whalen at the Mag Lab on looking at alternative closures in PPE. And so for those, it goes through the Research Foundation. They basically come to me and say, we have a problem. We want you to tackle it. Dr. Sherry and I have developed 2 new turnout suits that are market ready for 2 different companies via that stream. Okay. A little bit of it is our time that we'll capture in the summer because we're a 9-month contract. Okay, well, if we're going to work on this in the summer, we're not free labor, that kind of thing. Yeah. But, the university takes a percentage of that off the top. But usually with the foundation, we can negotiate that. That's negotiable a little bit. And then from there, started pursuing federal grants, had to put my name in the hat a few times before it hit. But, that's great experience. You become a reviewer on those grants. You learn there's kind of a formula for each, whether it's NSF, NIH, or I typically applied to FEMA has a firefighter grant program. And so now I kind of know what they're looking for and that kind of thing. And that's a 3-year max cap of $1.5 million. So we had about a $500,000 project. Now we've got a $1.5 million. So we're super excited about that. A lot of that's tied up in subs. So sub awards or subcontractors. I've got 2 manufacturers on this one. My colleague at NC State, she's 300, 400K. We've got some other small orgs that help us out. So by the time you get down to what FSU has, and then FSU takes 54% off of that, you're actually not working with a whole lot. In fact, when I was budgeting for that this time last year, and I was putting in everyone's top dollar request, I'm at $2.2 million. This isn't going to work, right? I got to cut $700K here. And, postdoc time is on that. So our postdoc is fully funded on that. And so it adds up really quickly. If you take, let's say $70,000 a year for a postdoc, well, you times that by 2 and a little bit more because FSU is going to get, a portion of that, 54% of that. So it adds up pretty quickly. And then we've also done a lot of sort of contracts, work for the military. Those are more formal types. We're currently getting ready to receive some federal earmarks as well. That's going to fund a new hot plate. That's like $170,000 piece of equipment.
And what's a hot plate? What's it do? I mean, besides make pancakes?
I wish, right? It's actually like a fabric level version of the mannequin. So that fabric level thermal protection test, it's the equivalent of that, but for breathability.
Okay.
So that will be really nice because that'll round out our capabilities in terms of fabric level, mannequin level, and then I do a lot of human wear testing as well. So we'll have all those capabilities in the Thermal Comfort Lab specifically. But then the other thing that, thanks to Dean Fiorito, she was able to get our approval on, and we did this back in 2018, I think, 2019, was we have a testing auxiliary account. And that's what kind of runs as its own business. And I kind of run that as its own business. And I do that just really on the side. I don't take a cut from that or anything. It's not part of my job description, if you will, but it funds our students. It funds graduate research. It funds that I have $25,000 a year I have to cover every year on maintenance and chamber and mannequin. That's just in the Thermal Comfort Lab.
Okay.
So both that lab and the textile testing lab both operate as what we call service for fee-based labs. So basically anyone around the world can send a request and say, hey, can you test this for us? And we have a rate methodology that we calculated that says yes, and this is what we charge you. So I created a testing order form, and then we do the work, we give them a report. And then when they call saying, can we meet to talk about this? Can you do this and that? Can you tell us what this means? That's when we start talking about, okay, that's either research or that's some consulting or something like that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'd like to shift gears now to personally, where are you from? What's your upbringing like? Were you poor, middle class? Were you just sipping champagne on yachts? Kind of give what's the backfill of your what origin story?
Sure.
I think they call it.
Yeah, well, the students tell me I have an accent. I don't know what they're talking about, but I'm from Kentucky, and so I was grew up in a small rural town about 30 miles south of Lexington, on a 300-acre beef, cattle, and tobacco farm.
Oh, wow.
I was walking behind the tobacco setter, as soon as I could walk, right? So I definitely grew up between my parents and my grandparents and my aunt and uncle. We all had farms kind of in the same road. And so I grew up on the farm, and there was always something to be done. There was little time to rest. And I think that's what instilled the work ethic in me that I have today. I know when I started working in the lab at UK, a few years later, my professor there told me, she said, I always knew that you would be a hard worker because you grew up on a farm, So it just instills, you don't get to wait until you decide you want to do it, right? There's animals, there's crops that you got to do it. And so that was part of it. My parents instilled in me a really strong work ethic. I was expected to work hard, and no matter what I did, right? If it was school, extracurriculars, things like that. So definitely, realized from a young age that I pretty much had anything that I could, ever need, and most of what I wanted, right? Mm-hmm. But always wanted to strive for more. I'm that typical oldest daughter, type A, perfectionist, overachiever. That's my personality, and that's kind of what shaped me from early childhood on. Yeah.
So your parents, farmers, did they get your education path?
Yeah.
How did that go?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my dad actually was the only college graduate in our family.
All right.
My dad has a degree in Ag Econ from the University of Kentucky. And funnily enough, the Textiles and Apparel program at UK is in the College of Agriculture. And I also have a degree in career and technical education. That was my other major. I always wanted to teach, always loved to teach. And that was in the College of Ag as well. So really was fortunate fortunate because my dad had a pretty nice legacy from his time there and had a lot of connections. And that certainly served me well as I came through the college. But really, also my parents were super supportive. My mom did not have the opportunity to go to college. She always wanted to, but the funds were not there to do that. And so I still remember to this day when we were shopping for my dorm, I know she was more excited about it than I was, And my mom has set a great example for me because she's worked outside the home, and she has always, in every area of her career, has always strive to do more. And she's, been promoted and moved up and out and that type of thing. So I definitely saw that hard work between the farm, between both of their careers, that really pushed me. They've always set excellent, really high standards and expectations for me and my brother, for sure.
No, that's really interesting. So you were, a farm life. I just couldn't even, I'm from Los Angeles.
Yeah, you
so
can imagine.
I think the first wild animal I saw was when I moved to Tallahassee. So very different upbringing. So you were talking about earlier before we went live about a quote that is outside your office by Tom Ferriss. Can you give us that quote and tell us a little bit about how that shapes how you view entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship education?
Absolutely. So there's a quote outside my office door that I absolutely love. It says, "An entrepreneur is not someone who owns a business, but someone who makes things happen." And, when I first came to FSU, we were not in the College of Entrepreneurship. We were in the College of Human Sciences, which is disbanded and merged around campus. And there was a lot of unknowns in that first, 1 to 2 years that I was here. And Susan, Dean Fiorito, kind of came in and was definitely our program's savior. Having a prior appointment in that program, I know that she was definitely able to identify with us and certainly was supportive and has continued to be supportive in so many ways. And so for me, though, we're all kind of probably sitting back going, well, entrepreneurship, how does this make sense? People will ask us that. And what I love about entrepreneurship is that it's so multidisciplinary. It crosses every single discipline on campus, right? And I love that quote, and I love that it's right outside my office because, what I do for the university, whether it's going out and getting federal grants, whether it's doing the service for fee-based testing, I'm an entrepreneur basically for the university, and I'm an entrepreneur for myself. I can choose to pay my summer salary. I go out and I do consulting, right? Things like that. And so it's definitely a very unique opportunity that we have here to be a standalone college, right? The only standalone college of entrepreneurship, and all the support that we have from Jim Moran. It's just, I couldn't picture or have fathomed a better scenario of support.
No, thank you for sharing that. And wanted to ask you just kind of your viewpoint on entrepreneurship education, and maybe tell us a little bit about the courses that you teach and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, sure. So I love that we have students with so many different interests in our college. So I'm teaching mostly retail entrepreneurship or textile and apparel entrepreneurship students, and we get a pretty good mix, some years more than others, of students who ultimately want to design for themselves or, have their own product line or their own styling business. But a lot of times too, going out and gaining that experience in a company where it's kind of, you've got some support and backing there, right? And then taking that experience and going out and building off of that on their own. And that may be what they're looking to do as well. And so I teach classes in textile science, quality assurance, product evaluation, like from start to finish, right? How do you ideate all the way through to final production, actually to the point of purchase, right? And all the things that you need to think about in terms of how that garment might be perceived, how that product is going to actually perform beyond that perceived quality, because that's all a customer really knows, right? They have an idea, but they don't know the known quality or the known value of that. And so we talk through that and how to avoid issues, so you're not damaging brand loyalty or reputation and things like that. And so I love, though, that I'll get commercial entrepreneurship students that'll email me and say, hey, we're developing a new hemp clothing line, and I give them a crash course in textile science in 30 minutes in my office, right, and leave their head spinning. I did that with William McCarthy a few years ago with Dunsel's, and he's like, what do you mean warp and filling? I'm like, well, you got to know what direction you're cutting it, So I love to do that and to interface. And like, for example, Nightcap It, we did a lot of testing in the textile lab years ago to help them out. So that's always fun, too, to interface with students even outside of retail entrepreneurship. And again, it just speaks to the collaborative potential, right, of all these different disciplines in one college.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for sharing your perspective on entrepreneurship education. It's always fun to hear just different colleagues, how they view it and how they go about it. So I always like to end the podcast asking the question, if you could go back and tell, let's say, 20-year-old Meredith one thing, what would you tell 20-year-old Meredith?
Yeah, I think I did a really great job of saying yes to opportunities, but one thing that I've always probably struggled with, I would say, is confidence. And I think a lot of that comes with being, in my case, being a woman in a more male-dominated field. I never will forget in grad school at Kentucky, I took an engineering course, okay? And unbeknownst to I was the only female in the course. Unbeknownst to all my male peers, I had already been certified in Lean Six Sigma. And this, which is a problem-solving course. It's a certification. It's about $3,000. You take 2 separate weeks. You do a semester's-long project. It's rigorous. You have to present and basically be judged by a black belt because there's different levels. It's not karate, and it's used in a lot of corporate applications as well, but NC State teaches one specific to textiles. So I presented, I had done this huge semester-long project. It had already been presented and vetted to GE. GE adopted it into their processing. And so I was taking it because I needed an elective. I had used all the electives in our program, and I'm like, well, I've already done this, so this shouldn't be too difficult, right? And I never will forget, it was, day one of class, and we get this assignment. We had to work in a group of 4. And we're divvying up the homework. And I said, okay, well, I'm pretty good at Excel. Like I said, okay, well, I'll take that part and get all the data into Excel and organize it. I never will forget this male student across the table from me. He looked up at me and he said, do you even know how to use Excel? And so I think, oftentimes there were times throughout, especially graduate school, where I felt like an imposter. And I know that's normal. You can read a lot about their imposter syndromes. I still get a little nervous, right? Anytime before I do a presentation, and that's really because you care, right? But certainly I think just if I could go back and say, like, you deserve to be in this space, right? I was the first, and to this day, to my knowledge, still the only non-textile engineering, chemistry, and science student that my PhD advisor ever worked with. Okay. And so after about 6 months, another male colleague finally stood up and said in a meeting, she doesn't sew, right? So there was this assumption that because I was a woman, that I don't sew. And I struggled with that. And I went to my other professor and said, I'm not a chemist. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a designer. I'm not a pattern maker. I don't know what I am. And he said, well, stop telling me all the things you aren't, start telling me what you are, right? Yeah. And that's where my identity started to be shaped and formed. And that's partly the process of graduate education and going through that marathon of a journey, right? It's a lot of ups and downs. So just if I could go back and, in a lot of those lows, right, in those valleys, be able to say, you're okay. You're going to get through it. You deserve to be there just as much as everyone else in the room. Yeah.
That's a good word, and it's a word that I think all of us need to hear, especially 20-somethings and things like that. I feel like 20-somethings so often don't feel like they belong or somebody else should be in that space, and I think we all need to be reminded. I
still have to remind myself of that.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, Meredith, thank you so much for coming in, and thank you so much from a dad's heart, all the work that you're doing on the behalf of female firefighters. That's fantastic. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the InNOLEvation Mindset podcast powered by the Jim Moran College of Entrepreneurship. Hey, if you like this episode, hey, take a time to make sure you drop a like, make a comment, and share it on your social media. That helps us get the word out, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss another great episode of the InNOLEvation Mindset. Hey, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.